Before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe because this story will change how you see family forever.
Oh my God!
The news spread through Lagos like wildfire. Chief Adewale was dead. One moment, he was sitting at the head of a billion-dollar meeting, his voice firm, his presence commanding the room. And the next, he collapsed without warning. No goodbye, no final words, just silence. At his mansion, the atmosphere turned heavy. His wife, Kemi, sat frozen, staring at the marble floor as if the truth hadn't reached her yet. Tunde, his only known son, paced back and forth, his heart racing, not just with grief, but with something else, fear. "How is this possible?" he muttered under his breath. "He was fine this morning." But deep down, something felt wrong. Chief Adewale was a man of control, a man of secrets, and men like him don't just leave the world without leaving something behind. As the family gathered, whispers began to grow, because everyone knew one thing: when a man like Adewale dies, the real story is just beginning. In the heart of Lagos, where ambition never sleeps and power speaks louder than words, one name stood above the rest: Chief Adewale. His mansion wasn't just a home, it was a symbol. Towering gates, polished marble floors, and a fleet of luxury cars lined up like silent soldiers. Everything about him screamed control, success, and undeniable dominance. Every morning, the staff moved with precision, careful not to make mistakes. They knew who they worked for. Chief Adewale was not just wealthy, he was feared. As he stepped into the grand dining hall, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, conversations stopped instantly. Even silence seemed to respect him. "Good morning, sir," one of the staff said softly, lowering his head. Adewale didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, taking his seat at the head of the long table. His presence alone was enough. Across from him sat his wife, Mrs. Kemi, elegant, composed, and always watching. Her eyes carried a quiet intelligence, but also something harder to read, something guarded. She sipped her tea slowly, observing both her husband and her son without saying a word. Tunde, their only known son, leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone with little concern. Expensive watch, designer clothes, effortless confidence. He had everything handed to him. But where his father commanded respect, Tunde demanded attention. "Dad, I'll need more funds for the new project," Tunde said casually, not even looking up. A slight pause filled the room. Chief Adewale's eyes lifted, sharp and unreadable. "More funds?" he repeated, his voice calm but heavy. "You've not even accounted for the last investment." Tunde exhaled, clearly irritated. "It's business. Risks happen." A silence followed, thicker this time. Mrs. Kemi finally spoke, her voice smooth but firm. "Tunde, your father built everything you see from nothing. Respect that." But Tunde only shrugged. Chief Adewale leaned back slowly, studying his son, as if trying to understand him, or perhaps questioning him. There was disappointment there, hidden beneath control. "I didn't build this empire for carelessness," he said quietly. The words hung in the air. Despite the wealth, the power, the perfection, something was missing. This was not a family built on love. It was built on expectation, control, and unspoken tension. And behind the luxury, behind the pride, there were cracks no one was ready to face. Behind the grand walls of the mansion, where everything looked perfect to the outside world, the truth was far more complicated. This was not a home filled with warmth. It was a space where silence often spoke louder than words. Tunde had always believed the empire would one day be his. After all, he was the only son, the heir everyone knew. But deep inside, he carried a quiet frustration. No matter how much he spent, no matter how confidently he spoke, his father never seemed impressed. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, the three of them sat together again at the long dining table. The distance between them felt larger than the table itself. "I don't understand why you never trust me," Tunde said suddenly, breaking the silence. His tone was controlled, but the irritation underneath it was clear. Adewale didn't respond immediately. He calmly placed his glass down, his eyes fixed on his son. "Trust is not given, Tunde," he said quietly. "It is earned." Tunde let out a dry laugh. "Earned? I've been here my whole life. What more do you want from me?" "What I want," Adewale replied, his voice still calm but sharper now, "is responsibility, discipline, not recklessness." The words hit harder than they sounded. Mrs. Kemi watched closely, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of the table. She had seen this pattern before, father and son locked in a quiet battle neither seemed willing to lose. "Tunde," she said gently, "your father is only trying to guide you." But Tunde shook his head. "No, mother, he's trying to control everything, including me." A brief silence followed, heavy, uncomfortable. For a moment, something flickered in Adewale's eyes, something deeper than anger, regret, or perhaps guilt, but it disappeared just as quickly. "You think this is control?" he said slowly. "Everything I've built, every sacrifice I made, was to give you a future." Tunde leaned forward slightly. "Then let me live it my way." Those words lingered in the air like a challenge. Mrs. Kemi's gaze shifted between them, her expression unreadable. She knew there were things Tunde didn't understand, truths that had never been spoken aloud. And Adewale, he knew something his son didn't, something that made every conversation feel incomplete. Because this wasn't just a conflict between a father and a son, it was a family built on secrets, slowly waiting to surface. The boardroom was alive with quiet tension as executives waited for Chief Adewale to speak. He stood at the head of the long table, his presence as commanding as ever, outlining a deal that could reshape his empire once again. Every word he spoke carried authority, every movement, control. "This expansion will double our reach within a year," he said firmly, his eyes scanning the room. "We don't wait for opportunities, we create them." A few heads nodded. Pens moved quickly across paper. Everything was as it always had been. Until suddenly, it wasn't. Adewale paused mid-sentence. His hand gripped the edge of the table, his expression tightening for just a second. A flicker of discomfort crossed his face, so brief most people almost missed it. "Sir?" one of the executives asked carefully. But before he could respond, the glass in Adewale's hand slipped, shattering against the polished floor. And then he collapsed. "Call an ambulance!" someone shouted. Chairs scraped violently as people rushed toward him, the room that once echoed with confidence now filled with panic. At the hospital, the bright lights felt colder than usual. Doctors moved quickly, voices overlapping, machines beeping in urgent rhythm. "We're losing him! Prepare the defibrillator!" Outside, Mrs. Kemi stood frozen, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her phone. Tunde paced restlessly, his heartbeat loud in his ears. "This doesn't make sense," Tunde muttered, running a hand through his hair. "He was fine. He was perfectly fine." Kemi didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the closed doors ahead, her thoughts racing faster than she could control. Something about this felt wrong, too sudden, too unfinished. Minutes felt like hours. Then finally, the doors opened. The doctor stepped out, his face calm but heavy. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "We did everything we could." The words didn't land immediately. Tunde blinked as if trying to process what he had just heard. No, that's not possible," he said, shaking his head. "You need to check again." But the doctor's silence said everything. Mrs. Kemi closed her eyes slowly, her breath unsteady. For a moment, the strong, composed woman disappeared, replaced by something fragile. Just like that, the most powerful man in Lagos was gone. No final instructions, no last words, no explanation. Only silence and questions no one could answer. And somewhere beneath the grief, beneath the shock, a deeper truth waited. Something Chief Adewale had taken to his grave, or so everyone thought. The day of the funeral arrived with a heavy sky hanging over Lagos, as if even the city itself was mourning. Outside the Grand Cathedral, a long line of luxury cars stretched across the street. Influential figures, business leaders, politicians, everyone had come to pay their respects to the man who once ruled with quiet power. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with silence and sorrow. Chief Adewale's portrait stood at the front, larger than life, his confident gaze frozen in time. White flowers surrounded his casket, their soft fragrance doing little to ease the weight in the air. "He was a great man," one of his business partners whispered to another. "Lagos won't see another like him." "And his empire," the other replied quietly. "Who takes control now?" Those words, though softly spoken, carried far more weight than sympathy. In the front row, Mrs. Kemi sat dressed in black, her posture straight, her face composed. To anyone watching, she looked strong, unbreakable even. But behind her stillness, her thoughts were restless. Too many unanswered questions, too many things left unsaid. Beside her, Tunde sat with his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed ahead. People approached him one after another, offering condolences, shaking his hand. "You're the man of the house now," someone told him. "You must carry on his legacy," another added. Tunde nodded each time, forcing a calm expression. But inside, something stirred. Pressure, expectation, and a growing sense of ownership. "This is mine now," he thought quietly. "Everything he built, it's mine." Yet for reasons he couldn't explain, that certainty didn't feel as solid as it should. As the ceremony continued, the priest spoke about legacy, about the impact of a life well lived. But while the world remembered Chief Adewale as a powerful and respected man, no one spoke of his flaws. No one mentioned the secrets he carried. Because to the public, he was perfect. But to those closest to him, the story was far from complete. As the casket was slowly lowered into the ground, a quiet breeze passed through the crowd. Some bowed their heads, others wiped away tears. And just as the final prayers were said, a quiet thought lingered in the air, unspoken but deeply felt. Was this truly the end of his story, or just the beginning of something far more complicated? 3 days after the funeral, the Adewale mansion felt quieter than usual, but not peaceful. The silence carried tension, thick, unspoken, and waiting to break. One by one, family members and close associates gathered in the main living hall, their eyes occasionally drifting toward the large wooden doors. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. At exactly noon, the doors opened, and the family lawyer stepped in, Mr. Balogun, calm, precise, and unreadable. He had worked with Chief Adewale for years, trusted with matters no one else knew about. "Thank you all for coming," he said, adjusting his glasses as he placed a sealed document on the table. "We are here to carry out the final wishes of the late Chief Adewale." A quiet shift moved through the room.
Tunde leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlocked, trying to appear calm, but inside, his thoughts were racing. "This is it," he told himself. "Everything finally comes to me." Mrs. Kemi sat beside him, her posture elegant as always, but her eyes were sharp, watching, analyzing every movement. "Before I begin," Mr. Balogan continued, "I want to make clear that this document was personally prepared and sealed by Chief Adewale himself. No changes have been made." A brief pause followed, just enough to build anticipation. The sound of paper breaking the seal echoed louder than expected. As the lawyer unfolded the document, every eye in the room locked onto him. Even the air felt still. "The late Chief Adewale," he began slowly, "has outlined the distribution of his assets, properties, and business holdings. Names were mentioned, properties listed, shares divided. But something felt off. The main estate, the core of the empire, had not yet been addressed." Tunde shifted in his seat, his patience thinning. "Excuse me," he said, his voice controlled but firm. "What about the main company holdings?" The lawyer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned a page slowly, his expression unchanged. "That," he said calmly, "is addressed in the final section." A silence fell. A different kind this time. Not curiosity, but something heavier, something uncertain. Mrs. Kemi's fingers tightened slightly in her lap, and Tunde, for the first time since his father's death, felt a small, unfamiliar doubt creep in. Because deep down, something was about to be revealed, something no one in that room was prepared to hear.
The room held its breath as Mr. Balogan adjusted the final page of the will. The air felt heavier now, charged with something no one could yet define. Tunde sat upright, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the lawyer. "This is the final section," Mr. Balogan said calmly. A pause followed, just long enough to make everyone uneasy. "The majority share of Chief Adewale's core business empire," he continued, "will not be transferred to his wife or his publicly recognized son." For a second, no one reacted. It was as if the words hadn't fully registered. Tunde blinked, his expression hardening. "What do you mean, not transferred?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. The lawyer didn't look at him. He simply continued reading. "These assets are to be given to his son." A small ripple of confusion passed through the room. Tunde frowned. "I'm his son." But then, "David Adewale." Silence. Complete, crushing silence. It felt like the entire room had stopped breathing. Mrs. Kemi's eyes widened just for a fraction of a second before she quickly masked it. But it was too late. Something had slipped. Tunde let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "This is a mistake," he said immediately, shaking his head. "There is no David. I'm his only son." Mr. Balogan finally looked up, his gaze steady. According to this legally binding document, Chief Adewale had another son, one whose identity was kept private. The words hit like a storm. "No," Tunde said, louder this time. "That's impossible. My father would never." He did. And not only that, he has left the majority of his wealth, including controlling shares, to him. Gasps filled the room. Relatives began whispering, confusion turning into disbelief. "Another son?" someone murmured. "For how long?" another voice asked. Tunde stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "This is fraud," he snapped. "Someone is lying. This David, whoever he is, this is fake." But deep down, something felt wrong. Because in that moment, a memory flickered in his mind, small, almost forgotten, moments when his father had seemed distant, distracted, carrying something unspoken. Mrs. Kemi remained seated, her face pale but controlled. Her silence said more than any words could. Mr. Balogan closed the document gently. "There is documented proof," he said, "and an address." The room fell quiet again. But this time, it wasn't just shock, it was realization. Chief Adewale had lived a life no one truly understood. And now, even in death, his greatest secret had just been exposed. The silence that followed the revelation didn't last long. It shattered suddenly, violently. "This is nonsense." Tunde's voice exploded across the room, his anger no longer controlled. He began pacing back and forth, his hands clenched tightly. "There is no other son. My father would never hide something like that from me." But even as he said it, doubt crept in. One of the relatives leaned forward, whispering sharply, "Then how do you explain the will?" Tunde shot him a glare. "I don't need to explain anything. This is clearly a setup. Someone is trying to steal what belongs to me." Mrs. Kemi finally stood up, her movements slow but firm. Her face remained composed, but her eyes burned with something deeper: hurt, betrayal, and something she refused to show fully. "Enough," she said quietly, yet her voice carried across the room. Everyone fell silent. She turned to the lawyer, her gaze sharp. "Are you telling me that my husband lived a second life?" Her voice didn't shake, but there was pain hidden beneath it. Mr. Balogan didn't answer immediately. "I am only presenting what he left behind," he said carefully. "The documents are clear." Kemi's lips pressed together. For a moment, she looked away, her thoughts racing. "All these years," she thought, "what else didn't I know?" Tunde slammed his hand against the table. "I won't accept this," he snapped. "This David, he's nothing, no one. He can't just appear and take everything." "But that's proof," another relative added quietly. "That doesn't matter," Tunde shouted, his voice cracking slightly now. "I'm the one who stayed. I'm the one who carried his name." His anger wasn't just about money anymore. It was personal. It was about identity, about being replaced, about realizing that the man he thought he knew, his father, had chosen someone else. Mrs. Kemi closed her eyes briefly, taking a slow breath. When she opened them again, her expression had changed. It was colder now, more calculated. "Where is he?" she asked. The question hung in the air. Mr. Balogan glanced down at the file. "There is an address listed." Another silence followed. But this one was different. This was no longer about denial. It was about confrontation. Because somewhere out there was a man none of them had ever met. A man who now held power over everything they believed was theirs. And whether they liked it or not, they were going to find him. The address written in the will didn't match the world they knew. No gated estate, no luxury district, just a quiet, overlooked part of the city where life moved slower and expectations were smaller. Mr. Balogan adjusted his glasses as he handed the file to the private investigator. "Everything we need should be here," he said calmly. "But be careful, this situation is delicate." The investigator nodded, flipping through the documents. "David Adewale," he read softly. "No public records tying him to the family, until now." That alone made the mystery deeper. Later that afternoon, a black car rolled into a narrow street lined with modest homes. Children played barefoot nearby, their laughter echoing freely, so different from the controlled silence of the Adewale mansion. "This is it?" the investigator muttered, glancing at the house number again. It was a small, worn building. Nothing about it suggested wealth or connection to one of the richest men in Lagos. From a distance, he observed quietly. A young man stepped outside, carrying a toolbox. His clothes were simple, his movements calm, focused. There was no sign of arrogance, no hint of power. "Is that him?" the driver asked. The investigators studied him closely. "It has to be David."
The name now carried weight, even if he didn't know it yet. David wiped sweat from his forehead, glancing briefly at the sky before heading towards a nearby motorcycle. His face showed quiet determination, the kind built from years of struggle, not privilege. Inside the file there were fragments of a hidden story. Old records, a birth certificate, financial transfers made quietly over the years. Nothing obvious, but enough to connect the dots. His mother passed away years ago, the investigator said, reading further. He's been on his own ever since. A brief silence followed. So he has no idea? The investigator asked. The investigator shook his head slowly. No, he doesn't. He looked back at David, who was now helping an elderly neighbor fix a broken gate. No cameras, no attention, just simple kindness. How could someone like him be connected to someone like Chief Adewale? The investigator thought. Two completely different worlds about to collide. Back at the mansion, Tundeng waited impatiently for answers, his frustration growing with every passing hour. But what he didn't realize is this. The man he was about to face was not what he expected. And sometimes, the biggest threats don't come from power. They come from the truth.
David Adewale lived a life few would call extraordinary, yet it was rich in character and kindness. In a small neighborhood on the outskirts of Lagos, he was known not for wealth or influence, but for his quiet reliability. He woke early every morning, greeted every neighbor with a smile, and worked tirelessly to repair homes, fix electrical wires, and help the elderly in his community. To them, he was a hero of small acts, an ordinary man with an extraordinary heart. Flashbacks occasionally swept through David's mind, moments of his childhood with his mother. She had been a gentle woman, always struggling but never complaining. "You must be strong, David," she would say, pressing a hand to his cheek. "Life will not hand you anything, but kindness will carry you farther than gold." He remembered her worn hands, her quiet smiles, and the way she whispered his father's name just once before disappearing from his life entirely. Those memories were both painful and comforting, reminders of roots he never fully understood. Though he had grown up without luxury, he carried himself with dignity. He never envied the lives of the rich, he only respected their struggles from afar. Children in the neighborhood followed him around, imitating his careful ways, learning from someone who taught more by actions than words. The community trusted him, relied on him, and loved him, unaware of the secret that would soon turn their world upside down. One evening, as he repaired a broken gate for a neighbor, he paused, wiping sweat from his brow. Why does life feel so complete here, and yet there's something missing, he wondered quietly. Little did he know, the very truth of who he was, son of Lagos's most powerful man, Chief Adewale, was waiting to reach him. A life he never imagined, inheritance and influence beyond his current understanding, was about to intersect with the humble world he had built for himself. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the streets, David smiled faintly, unaware that this same sun would soon shine on secrets buried for decades, bringing him face to face with a father he never knew, a family he never met, and a destiny he never expected. Sometimes the humblest hearts carry the heaviest truths and the strongest surprises. The mansion's grand hall felt different now, tense, charged, and almost suffocating. David had arrived, summoned by the address in the will, unaware that he was stepping into a world of power, greed, and disbelief. His calm, humble demeanor contrasted sharply with the sharp tension emanating from Tunde, who stood rigidly by the massive dining table, fists clenched.
You are him? Tunde's voice trembled between rage and shock. You just appear out of nowhere, and now everything is yours? David remained composed. I'm not here to take what isn't mine. I'm only following the instructions left by my father. His words were steady, but inside his heart beat faster. This is the moment my life changes, forever. Mrs. Kemi, standing behind Tunde, folded her arms, her eyes narrowing. David, are you telling me he had a second son, and we never knew? She whispered, disbelief tinged with hurt. Why? How could he hide this from me? The lawyer, Mr. Balagoon, stepped forward, placing the will on the table. Everything is documented. Chief Adewale wanted this done discreetly. It was his wish that David receives the majority share of the core business. Tunde's face contorted with anger. This is impossible. You're just a stranger. You can't just claim what's mine by law. David took a measured step forward. I didn't ask for this. I didn't grow up with your privileges, your luxury, or your wealth. All I have is what my father entrusted to me. His voice was calm, yet firm. I am his son. That's all that matters. For a moment, silence fell. Tunde's chest rose and fell rapidly, torn between denial and the undeniable truth staring him in the face. No, he loved me. I grew up as his son. I carried his name, he shouted, his voice cracking. And yet, he also loved me, enough to leave me a chance. That's what you didn't see. Mrs. Kemi's lips pressed together, her face pale. She had spent decades controlling her family, hiding secrets, but even she felt powerless in the weight of truth. The tension between the two men grew almost unbearable, the air thick with emotions that had been buried for decades. Finally, Tunde sank into a chair, the fight in him still burning, but tempered with realization. He glanced at David and whispered under his breath, I never expected this. David nodded slightly, understanding the storm he had entered. The confrontation had begun, but the family and their world would never be the same, because in that room, beneath the wealth and the legacy, a truth had surfaced, one that could no longer be ignored. The room fell into an almost sacred silence as Mr. Balagoon reached for the final envelope, a letter written by Chief Adewale himself. The paper was worn at the edges, the ink slightly faded, but every word carried weight beyond money or legacy. David and Tunde leaned forward, the tension between them momentarily paused, replaced by curiosity and something heavier, the gravity of truth. This, Mr. Balagoon began, his voice steady but soft, is a message from your father, words he wanted each of you to hear. David's heart thumped in his chest. He had spent his entire life without a father's guidance, and now here was the man, speaking across the boundaries of death. The lawyer unfolded the letter and began reading aloud. To Tunde, my son who has carried my name openly, I have watched you grow with pride and frustration. To David, my hidden son, I never revealed myself, but my love for you has always been there, silently guiding your life from afar. I leave this inheritance not to favor one over the other, but to give each of you what your lives needed. For Tunde, responsibility. For David, opportunity. I regret my choices, my mistakes, and I hope both of you will understand. A heavy silence filled the room after the last words were spoken. Tunde's eyes filled with unshed tears. For the first time, he felt the weight of a father's regret and the truth behind the emotional distance that had shaped his life. David, too, felt an unexpected swell of emotion. He had never sought revenge or recognition, but the letter gave him clarity closure and a strange sense of belonging. He realized that his father's love had been there all along, hidden, measured in a way that only a man like Adewale could express. Mrs. Kemi finally exhaled, her hands trembling slightly. The carefully maintained composure she had held for years now faltered as she processed the depth of secrets, regrets, and intentions that had governed this family's past. I never knew," Tunde whispered, his voice breaking. "I thought I understood him, but I didn't." David nodded, meeting his brother's gaze. "Neither did I, but now maybe we can start." And in that moment, the mansion was no longer just a house of wealth and power. It became a place where hidden truths had finally emerged, where regret was acknowledged, and where a family could perhaps begin to heal. Because sometimes it takes a lifetime or...
The mansion, once heavy with tension and secrets, now felt quieter, but not empty. The confrontation had ended, the letter had spoken, and yet the weight of realization lingered in the air. David sat by the large window, watching the Lagos skyline bathe in the evening sun. For him, life had changed in ways he had never imagined. Wealth, influence, and the legacy of his father were suddenly his to navigate, but more important than that was understanding the role of empathy, humility, and patience in this new chapter. Tunde, meanwhile, paced slowly across the polished floor, his mind replaying every moment since the will was revealed, the anger, the disbelief, and now, the understanding. He realized how blinded he had been by entitlement and pride, believing that inheritance defined him more than character did. "I thought I knew what it meant to carry my father's name," he thought quietly, "but I never understood responsibility or respect until now." Finally, he stopped near David. There was an awkward pause, a silence filled with unspoken history and raw emotion. I was wrong," Tunde admitted, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "All these years, I thought this was about me, about what I deserved. But I see now that it's about what he wanted us to learn, about who we are, not just what we inherit." David looked up, a faint smile touching his lips. "It's not easy," he said, voice calm, reflective, "to carry the weight of a name, to carry the mistakes of a father, and yet try to grow beyond them. But maybe that's the lesson. Our actions matter more than our legacy." Tunde nodded slowly, the anger and rivalry melting into understanding. "Maybe we can do this differently," he said. "Together, we can honor him, not just the empire, but the values he left behind." The brothers stood side by side, looking out over the city, feeling a subtle shift in their bond. They didn't need words to acknowledge the change. The tension had transformed into a tentative respect, the rivalry into cooperation, and the grief into purpose. David reflected on his humble upbringing, and Tunde on the privilege he had taken for granted. Both understood now that wealth could shape opportunity, but it was character, compassion, and growth that defined a life. As the sun disappeared behind the horizon, the mansion no longer felt like a place of secrets. It became a space of potential, a place where past mistakes could be acknowledged and a new story could begin. Sometimes, transformation doesn't happen in moments of victory. It happens in the quiet acceptance of truth and in the willingness to grow beyond it. For David and Tunde, that was only the beginning. As the dust of conflict settled and the echoes of family confrontation faded, a quiet reflection filled the mansion. The story of Chief Adewale, a man of immense wealth, power, and secrets, had reached its conclusion, but the lessons it left behind resonated far beyond the walls of that grand house. Wealth had not guaranteed happiness, authority had not ensured understanding, and even blood relations could not prevent misunderstanding or pain. The narrator's voice cuts through the silence, soft but commanding. Life is full of unexpected truths. Sometimes those we think we know the most are carrying burdens, regrets, and secrets we can never imagine. Chief Adewale's legacy was not only in the empire he built, but in the lessons he left for his sons, a reminder that character outweighs fortune, compassion outweighs pride, and understanding outweighs anger. Tunde now sat quietly, reflecting on the journey. He realized that his entitlement and anger had blinded him, and that recognition and respect were earned through actions, empathy, and patience, not inherited titles. "I thought inheritance made him my successor," he admitted silently, "but it is understanding and humility that define true succession." David, humble yet confident, understood that life had given him more than wealth. It had given him perspective, a family, and the chance to bridge divides that had long seemed impossible. He thought of his mother, of the lessons she had imparted quietly, and of the quiet community that had shaped him. Power is fleeting, he reflected, but integrity endures. Mrs. Kemi, standing by the window, finally allowed herself a small, contemplative smile. She had learned that control and secrecy could never replace honesty, and that love, in any form, is stronger than pride. The narrator concludes with a voice that lingers. Wealth can create opportunities, but it cannot replace truth. Secrets may be hidden, but they always have a way of surfacing. And in the end, it is not the empire we inherit that shapes us, but the choices we make, the compassion we show, and the courage to face the truth, even when it changes everything. As night fell over Lagos, the mansion no longer symbolized mere power or prestige. It had become a monument to reflection, growth, and transformation, a testament to lessons learned through love, loss, and revelation. And for David and Tunde, and for all who witnessed this story, the message was clear. The greatest inheritance is not money, nor status, nor power. It is understanding, integrity, and the courage to do what is right, even in the shadow of secrets.